thank you all so much for having me. Over the past 2 years, I've learned a lot about identity. I think there's 3 types of identity. As Christians, we know that our main identity is our identity in Christ, right? And that's one that's eternal, right? Since the moment we've been thought of by the Lord, and till eternity, we'll always have that we're made in the image of Christ, right? But there is other identities that are temporary identities. These are the identities that maybe people give us by how they view us. These are the identities that change situationally depending on what we're good at, what we're involved in. They're temporary. But I found in the past year that there's an importance to our, what I call semi-permanent identities. And these are the identities that are here with us as long as we're on earth, the ones that we're born with. They're our race, they're our gender, perhaps disabilities. These are the things that we will have as long as we're on earth. And they do affect us. And so today I'm going to be talking about cultural affirmation and how it relates to student success. And as I do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and my background, and hopefully it'll give us a good framework from which to continue the rest of it on. So my parents came from Ethiopia about 27 or 28 years ago. They were born there, and they actually met in Kenya and then came to the States right after they were married. So my dad was leaving Ethiopia during a bad time in our history where they were really persecuting Christians. And so he was in prison for his faith more than once, actually, and so was then fleeing from Ethiopia and went to Kenya to work. And my mom, on the other hand, she was there with, maybe you've heard of Youth with a Mission, discipleship training school. So she had left Ethiopia also to live in Kenya, and they met, they got married, and then they eventually came to Denver, Colorado, which is where I'm from. And so they met some people who are also Ethiopian in Denver, and they started this community that 20 years later is called Ethiopian Evangelical Church in Denver, of which my dad has been the pastor. And it's about 400 people now. But it started out really small, and it started out as just a place where they could, find some peace, find some stability. And it's really where I grew up. And so the majority of my friends that have been lifelong friends are friends that I have gotten through that church community. And so since those 20 years, many of my parents' relatives have come from Ethiopia, and they're also there. And so within a 10-minute radius from my house, all of my relatives live in. I remember I had a neighbor who would say, like, you guys have a lot of family reunions. I was like, what's a family reunion? Because we're literally always together. And so you see here, these are my our grandmas. 2 of them are sisters. The other one is on the other side of the family. And we really were raised together. So my whole real foundation comes from this kind of community. And so this right here, this is the graduation season 2013 when I graduated high school. You can see me, I'm distracted over there, and there's a group of others, about 13, maybe 15 to 20 of us all graduated. So in this group of students, every single person went to a 4-year college right after high school, which I think is pretty profound. And pictured, you see our children's minister is right there, Pastor Stan. Our associate pastor is up there, and then my dad right behind me, who's the senior pastor of our church. So it's a very strong-knit community. But one thing that I realize is that we have a lot of privilege. And that's something that I want to talk to you all a little bit about today. So as Ethiopian Americans, we have a little bit of privilege because unlike other immigrants, we did not have to deal with what our parents dealt with, which is like grieving the loss of a country that they didn't know if they'd ever come back to. We didn't have to deal with that. And then also, as Black Americans, we came to this country way after like the fighting for civil liberties was already done. We also didn't have to shoulder that responsibility. That's a privilege that we have. And so we didn't carry that burden, and we also don't carry those subsequent scars. And so when I look at us, I do notice that we're really privileged, and I do think that a lot of that comes from that. And so as I said, everyone went to college. I came here from Colorado, and I'm so thankful for that opportunity. I heard about DBU because my pastor actually graduated from here, my youth pastor, who was not in that picture. And when I came here, I really thought that heaven had come and touched our beautiful campus, and I was so impressed. When I came as a senior to visit, I remember my parents came to the Patriot cafeteria, and they were talking to a student who was sharing their testimony, and they were bawling. And I was like, okay, obviously I'm coming here, and there's I don't even have a choice about it at this point. so I was so happy, and I knew that this is what God had for me. And at this point in my life, I'm more sure than ever that this is what God had for me. But it didn't take long for me to realize, oh, we're actually imperfect people here, and everyone is actually not, dropped from heaven's sky. We're actually human beings. And so just a few weeks into my freshman year, I experienced the very first experience that I had ever had of overt racism. And Labor Day weekend, a Whataburger incident gone wrong, and from that point on, I really began to view the world in a little bit of a different way. And in that semester, I kind of was just picking up different moments that I was putting them in my pocket. And when I came Thanksgiving, I remember sitting around the kids' dinner table with all my community and especially the young kids, and we were sharing instances. And I remember even that night calling my friend is this a Texas thing? Is this, I don't really know what's going, has this ever happened to you before? She's really, you just described my whole freshman year. And I was really surprised by that. And that night at Thanksgiving, the first semester of being in college, my uncle, one of our uncles, he was actually talking with us. And really what he was sharing with us, he did not even share his own personal experiences, but was really teaching us about a history that I had never heard before in that way, the history of what it is to be Black in America. And I realized that our experiences, it's just not my personal experience or my cousin's personal experience, they're really part of a greater narrative. And so it really expanded my view. And as we go on, I'd like to take a moment to talk about empathy. So when I was in high school, Trayvon Martin, if you guys know him, he was one of the first of this long list of Black men, usually sometimes women, who have been killed. And it lit like fire in the news, if you guys remember. But I remember when I was in high school, I really observed it all in a very detached manner. It didn't affect me. I was just what's going on? And it was really just daily news. And when I look back at that time, what I really noticed is that it was really a lack of empathy that elicited that response from me. And so empathy, I understand now, it fuels our understanding and compassion in our human interactions. And psychologists are finding that really even when we look at people who we consider to be in the out group, our brainwaves, when we hear their situation, our brainwaves are not even registering empathy towards them as we would for someone in our in-group reaction. So just a small example of what that might look like. If I see someone who I consider to be in my in-group going through a situation, for example, losing a job, if he's in my in-group, I might say, that's so difficult, the job market is really tough. I understand what you're going through. I wonder if I can help. If I see him and he's in my out group, I perceive, then perhaps I'll say, maybe it's up to a moral or character flaw that he's in that situation. Does that make sense? That's what we call the empathy gap. And I noticed that I had that in myself. But when we talk about these, as we continue to move on here, I want to encourage us to not only engage our minds as we look at all these statistics and these trends for minority race students and what it looks like for them in public education and higher education. Let's not only engage our minds, let's also engage our hearts and pursue that empathy, even if it doesn't come naturally, as psychologists are telling us, that it does not come naturally. Two, I'd like to encourage us to look past individual circumstances. Something that, when we talk about race in America, one of the most common themes that I've noticed is this idea of personal responsibility. We say, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, why don't you work harder? Why don't you do more? Why don't you just take a little bit of responsibility for yourself and, do better? Which there's a role for personal responsibility in all things. It's important. But in education, personal responsibility will tell a student, you're just lazy. Why don't you work hard? Why don't you study more? And it'll tell them these things while dismissing the other layers that are affecting them in their educational pursuit, right? So personal responsibility, it's a good thing. It's something to be considered, but we don't want to consider it alone. And so as we go on, we're going to look at something called the school-to-prison pipeline. And so my focus in the class that I'm taking, my independent study, is really on college. But we cannot talk about college without talking about what it takes to get to that point, the road to higher education. The school-to-prison pipeline is being called one of the biggest civil justice issues of our time. It's the idea that students students of color who are in the public education system are being pushed into the criminal justice system through their schools. And so we're going to look at some statistics. The graphs are kind of crazy. I'm going to try to do my best to explain it to you guys. So here we have a graph of students receiving suspension and expulsion, and it's divided by race. So if you see up top, the first tier is the light blue is white students. And the first right here is enrollment. So 51% of students enrolled are white, 2% are either biracial or multiracial, 24% Hispanic or Latino, 16% Black or African American, 0.5% Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, 5% Asian, and 0.5% American Indian and Alaska Native. So ideally what we would see is, according to enrollment, like the suspension rate would follow. So for example, if there's 50% white students, the amount of suspended students should be 50% white. That would be ideal. What we're seeing is people receiving in-school suspension. White students and that make up 51% of the school population are being suspended 40% of the time. When we look at biracial students, it's pretty linear, it's pretty normal. When we look at even Hispanic students, not too much deviation. When we look at Black students, unfortunately what we see is while Black students make up 16% of the population, they're 32% of this in-school suspension, 33 out-of-school suspension, 42% out-of-school suspension multiple times, and 34% of the expulsion rate. So as we look at the next statistic, personal responsibility is going to tell us, like, perhaps you should behave better. And that's something to consider. But as we look at the next slide, what we're going to see is that this doesn't just start it's not just something that happens, kids in junior high, maybe they have an attitude, or in high school. But we're seeing that even in preschool, these statistics are showing themselves out. So of enrollment, when we look at Black students first, this yellow right here, 18% enrolled in preschool are Black. 42% of out-of-school suspensions and 48% of out-of-school suspension multiple times are Black students, which is unreal. And so we need to consider why that happens. There's a study done in Texas not too long ago that really kicked this idea of the school-to-prison pipeline in high gear. It was of 300 schools, and it looked at it looked at so many things about suspension and students who were getting in trouble in schools. But it looked at, it told us that basically of students suspended, 97% of students suspended are suspended for something that was possibly subjective or pretty much not outlined by law. So of the things that you could do, of the crimes that you could commit, only 3% of suspensions were like a legal issue. 97 were what we call discretionary offenses. While that does include school fighting, it also includes things that are kind of subjective, like, for instance, like disrespect or something like that. And so when we're looking at students going into college, we have to consider what they're up against, basically. We have to consider where they're coming from. This next slide just is kind of an extension of that. So those students are being suspended. These students, they're pretty similar statistics, they're pretty similar graphics, but they're the ones who are being pushed directly into the criminal justice system, who are being referred to law enforcement. And that's something to consider. What effect it has on the student, and also what effect it has on their justice sheet, right? If does it lead to them getting more involved in crime? Does it lead to them, or does this help them actually change? That's what we need to consider, basically. And but like I said, my focus today is on college students. And so as we move on, I want to define college success with these 4 things. Someone who's a successful student in college, they are, first of all, they stay in college. Retention or some people use the word persistence. We want students to stay in college past their first year, stay until they graduate, basically. social engagement. We know that a big part of the college experience is your social, how you get along with people, the fact that you have friends, those are things that we want. Academic achievement, obviously we want everyone to do well. And the last thing is student satisfaction. And so if you've been engaged in the news, what you might have seen is that a lot of students are not satisfied with their college experience. And so, especially students of color. But when we look at this guy, his name is Vincent Tinto, he has this theory of integration about how students should be integrated, how students will stay on college campuses. And he says that, first of all, if a student needs to enter with a commitment to their goals, they need to then be really self-determined and also have some type of academic and social integration. He's saying also that not only do they need to have all these things, but one will lead to the other. So someone who is really committed to their goals will then be really determined to achieve them, will then academically integrate and socially integrate into their campus, and thus they will graduate in the 4 years. A lot of people are pushing against this idea because they're saying that it is in fact like pushing for a cultural suicide of sorts, because this commitment, this academic and social integration, it doesn't just mean that you're excited about what's going on in your campus. It means you're forgetting what happened at home. You're forgetting, like you're cleaving to your new friends, your new social groups at your college, but you're also forgetting and disassociating yourself with your friends from home. What that means for students of color often is a great deal of loss. And so we find that students of color are not graduating. 5 years is the typical amount for students to graduate, but we're finding that students of color are not really graduating at the same rate as white students. And so in this chart, we see black students are this yellow right here. 35% are graduating on time. And white students are this orange right here, which also is not the best, right? I think we want more for all students, but we see an inequality here. And so as we continue, if y'all have heard of what is happening in Mizzou, a lot of students recently are really pushing against what's going on in their campus environments. And just to share a little bit about my experience on campus, I think it is fueled in part by what is going on culturally with, as I mentioned, Trayvon Martin before. For me, so after I told y'all about my Thanksgiving experience, where I was like, man, there's more going on than I have previously considered. After that experience, I started to read more, research more, and more people were showing up in the media. And the unique thing about our time right now is that everything is accessible to you on your phone, right? You have like eternal resources, eternal news sources on your phone. And that can be dangerous in this situation because you have access to like video footage that perhaps you don't need to be seeing, right? When I'm talking specifically about the video footage of people who are passing, and you get to see that, and it's really difficult for a lot of students. And I think it increases the problems that we have been seeing with students of color, who are because of this new news footage, because of all this thing happening with students of color, because of all these people dying, I think it creates bigger barriers for them. And so, as I said, students in Mizzou, they're really stepping up and saying that we want more from our college campus. We want a college campus that is not just, that really stands for diversity in an intentional way, that creates an environment that doesn't just say you should be more determined to your goals, that creates a space for them to be more determined for their goals. And so what we're seeing is that black students are more likely to be dissatisfied with their college environments, and they're more likely to have lower academic achievement, as we said. They're more likely to perceive the college environment as more racially hostile, and so we want to do more about it. And so the best, as I'm doing my research, the best thing that I've been able to find is this 9-point step process by this man. It's called a culturally engaging campus environment model. And so it's a whole lot of words. I'm going to distill it to you simply. First of all, every campus should provide a space for students of color to associate with other students of color. Every campus should also provide a space for students of color to associate with their communities in community service. And also students should have opportunities for meeting cross-cultural engagement. So I think a bigger deal, we're seeing some students of color are not being able to kind of bridge that cultural barrier. They're seeing distance and feeling alienated. And so when these things are provided, it allows them to be more socially integrated, which we're saying social integration leads to academic achievement that's better, and a great deal more. And one other thing that I want to address here is something called, when they say a culturally validating environment. A culturally validating environment looks at your cultural perspective and says, not only is it valid, but it's valued here. And so that's something that we definitely want to strive for in our universities. And so this model, as you can see, these are just two visuals. All those things, those 9 are up there. And it takes into account, there's external factors and other reasons for student departure on campuses, obviously financial reasons, obviously academic reasons. But it's really telling us that a culturally engaging campus environment will increase a student's sense of belonging, their academic dispositions, and their academic performance, which will lead to better outcomes, which is what we want here. And so this is just a more simple version of that. But so social implications that we want to consider when we're here. The 3 social implications are this. We want to pursue cultural integrity. So the opposite of cultural integrity is cultural suicide, which is what Vincent Tinto's theory says. Vincent Tinto's theory says, leave everything that you are and cleave to whatever the dominant campus culture is. We don't want to do that. We want to pursue cultural integrity. A cultural integrity validates your experiences, and one way to do that is by having ethnic-based organizations and ethnic-based student groups. So like Black Student Union, all that, those kind of things. The African Student Alliance we have here, international organizations. Those help students of color see people like themselves. That helps, as we said, their overall disposition. We want to embrace campus subcultures. So there's a book called Why Are All the Black Students Sitting Together at the Lunch Table, or something like that. And I think we wonder if that is more divisive or if that brings us together. But we really shouldn't fear students coming together, is basically what this point says. And that also affirms the idea of student organizations and ethnic student-based organizations. And the last thing is recognizing beneficial cultural agents. And a cultural agent is an agent basically that allows for bicultural socialization, which is basically that allows for a student to embrace their personal culture while also embracing the culture of the dominant society, which is really our goal here because we want to grow in both. And so cultural agents a lot of times are like faculty and staff. That faculty and student relationship is really important. And that's why a lot of students are really pushing for more diverse faculty, and that definitely helps with that. So we want to add cultural agents, but not only does it have to be a faculty, but peer-to-peer relationships are definitely bicultural, but definitely increased bicultural socialization. As an RA, I've noticed that the idea of an RA or that role is definitely a cultural agent that can allow students to biculturally socialize. So personal considerations. The first one is to become socially responsible. For me, when I was looking at a lot of the protests and stuff that were going on, it definitely affected me in a very unique way. And by the end of my sophomore year, I really had deleted all social media. I figured I really could not take in any more of that. And that burden was doubled by the fact that I felt that no one in my area was receiving that information that I was receiving. No one in my area cared. And so the idea of becoming socially responsible is really important. No one should have to teach there are certain things that we don't need to be taught anymore. With the access that we do have to media, with the access that we have to news on our phones, on our Twitter timelines, we can definitely become more socially responsible and take on the burden of understanding different current events and also different cultures. The next thing is to establish yourself as a person of peace. Once you know the information, it's important to do something about it. It's important to say something about it. The idea of being a person of peace really comes from a point in the Bible where Jesus tells his disciples to go out 2 by 2 and look for a house. And if the people welcome them into the house, then they can go in and their ministry would grow from there, basically. And those people would be persons of peace. When you make yourself a person of peace, you make yourself a safe haven where a student can come to when they need to let out frustrations, when they need to share about hurt that's going on in their lives. So become a person of peace. And the last thing is to embrace opportunities to be a cultural agent. So one thing I really do appreciate about DBU is our commitment to the local church. When we were looking at that cultural engagement model that was made by Samuel Mucius, we see that one big thing that they mentioned is that students of color flourish in a community-centered environment. The best community-centered environment that we have is the local church. And so our involvement with the local church, our engagement with the local church is really effective in creating really meaningful relationships that we talked about earlier. And so it's really important to be a cultural agent. It's really important so the church is what I'm saying is the church is a cultural agent. It's important to embrace the opportunities to perhaps be the ride giver. Allow yourself to be giving rides to people to those things. And also we have different things on campus, like we have a mentoring program that you can establish yourself as being a part of. We have pretty much every club that we have. We do a really good job at allowing opportunities, but we want to take the opportunities when they come. And so I want to say thank you guys so much for allowing me to be here, and thank you so much for allowing me to share my experience.